Hi, it's a pleasure to talk to you about the trial that we did last year during our meningococcal meningitis outbreak in Niger. A bit of background. Outbreak response in the meningitis belt is basically centered around enhanced surveillance, case management, and then reactive vaccination campaigns. We know that these reactive vaccination campaigns often come late, and that's because of a lot of structural reasons. Vaccine supplies are kept out of country, managed by the International Coordinating Group, and it just takes time to get vaccines in people's arms. As a result, the impact of reactive vaccination is mitigated, and we know that if we could do it faster, we might have better results. But the fact is that these epidemics, especially at a localized level, are very fast events. This is compounded by the fact that there's a very limited supply on a global level of vaccine against serogroup C meningococcus, which is the prevailing circulating strain causing epidemics the last few years. There were only 2.5 million doses available for the entire meningitis belt this past season. Now, antibiotic prophylaxis is commonly used in the developed world. In fact, it's recommended in the developed world. The idea is that the germs that cause meningococcal meningitis, the meningococcus, live here in the nasopharyngeal mucosae, and then they eventually cross into the bloodstream, see the meninges, and cause meningitis. The idea of giving prophylaxis is to actually cut it out here, at this step there, to clear the carriage out of the nasopharynx. But this is not recommended in the meningitis belt during epidemics, largely because there's no evidence. No one's ever looked at whether it works. And then added to that is concern about, well, we're already doing reactive vaccination and case management. Can we add another activity to this, especially for something that's not proven? The thoughts about this were actually reconsidered after the emergence of this serogroup C meningitis, and a WHO panel actually recommended that someone look into the use of antibiotic prophylaxis in epidemics after the 2015 outbreak. So we designed a trial that's a 3-arm, open-label trial, cluster randomized, to assess the impact of single-dose oral ciprofloxacin, either when given to household contacts of meningitis cases or to entire villages of meningitis cases. And we looked at the impact of that on the overall attack rate during an epidemic. Now, there were 3 arms in the trial. The first arm, standard care. Cases were treated as normal, and no one got prophylaxis. In the second arm, again, cases were treated as normal, but we offered ciprofloxacin to household contacts of notified cases within 24 hours. And all of these doses were given at home and directly observed by a nurse. In the third arm, after a case had been notified in a village, we actually offered single-dose oral ciprofloxacin to everyone living in the village. And we did that within 72 hours of the notification of the first case from that village. And again, all doses of Cipro were directly observed, and we used an age-based scale. And we treated everyone of all ages, children, adults, pregnant women. Villages were randomized to one of those 3 arms after the first case was notified in that village. If there were multiple cases, if a household was only eligible for a distribution once, so if they received a distribution on Monday, and then 3 or 4 days later, someone else in the household became sick, we didn't offer a second round of prophylaxis. Similarly, a village could only get 1 mass distribution. We based everything on attack rates, so we had good surveillance in place, both to look for cases, with a dedicated nurse using WHO definitions and MOH procedures for sending samples to the central lab, and then also to look at what the attack rates were. We have to have a good denominator, so we performed exhaustive door-to-door censuses in all of the villages included in the trial. Again, the primary outcome was to look at the attack rates in the 3 arms. Not talking about individual level, but to look at attack rates in the 3 arms, to look at the strategies and epidemic response. We also looked at potential confounders, such as the age structure of the villages, and also importantly things like the rains, which we know have a big impact on ending meningitis epidemics. Now, we talked a lot this morning about antibiotic resistance, and here I am talking about giving mass distributions of ciprofloxacin to everyone. So obviously one of the things we're very concerned about this strategy is its potential impacts on antibiotic resistance patterns. Now, the concern with ciprofloxacin is much less related to the meningococcus, which is a very fragile bacteria. A single dose of ciprofloxacin will eradicate it. But it's more for the effects that it could have on enteric infections that we use ciprofloxacin to treat, things like your salmonellas. So we took 200 individuals in the control arm and 200 individuals in the village-wide prophylaxis arms, and we actually collected stool samples from them on day 0, before any ciprofloxacin, day 7, and day 28. And we compared the carriage rates of both ciprofloxacin-resistant and ESBL-resistant enterobacteriae. And then lastly, village leaders were the ones that provided informed consent for the permission for the randomization of their villages. We followed all of the guidelines set forth on the Ottawa Statement for conduct of cluster randomized trials. This was a very fast epidemic, and it was a fast trial. The trial start criteria were met on the 20th of April 2017, and within 36 hours we began including villages. This was a protocol that was prepared in advance, and we had the materials ready. About 3.5 weeks later, it rained. And then, sort of as I was talking about how vaccination always comes late, a couple days after that, vaccination was started independently of the trial. But then, as you notice, it only took place over about the course of a month. About a month later, the last case had been notified. So it was very fast. This slide begins to show some of the results, which will be coming out next week. At baseline, the villages in each of the 3 arms were very similar, both in terms of their population structure, but then also in terms of when they were included in the trial over the course of the epidemic. And these are our primary results. We see that in the control arm, the attack rate was 451 per 100,000 people. And in the household prophylaxis arm, it was 386. And in the village-wide prophylaxis arm, it was 190 per 100,000, which was a significant difference. When we looked at potential confounders, the only one that actually stuck with it as being significant was whether the village was included before or after the rains. And taken all together, it translates into about a 60% reduction in attack rate in the village-wide prophylaxis arm. In terms of laboratory results, only 52 samples were sent out of the 248 total cases post-randomization. That's less than we would have liked. We're reassured that all of those that were positive for serogroup C meningococcus. Interestingly, and again, the numbers are very small here, but in the standard care arm, there were 16 positives out of the 28 tested. In the household prophylaxis arm, there were 5 confirmed cases out of the 16 tested, and there were actually no confirmed cases in the village-wide prophylaxis arm, but again, with a very small number that were actually tested. What I was talking about in terms of the rapidity of these epidemics, especially on a localized level, sort of shows here on these curves. On the top, you see the epidemic curves in the standard care arm, in the middle, the household prophylaxis arm, and you see that the big difference, we saw a 60% reduction, that difference is really coming here in the first few days after randomization, showing the importance of doing an intervention quickly. In terms of resistance, the results were quite surprising. And again, I'm going to be very clear here. We're talking about fecal carriage. We're not talking about invasive disease. We're not talking about invasive strains. We're talking about carriage of resistant organisms. And the baseline carriage was much, much higher than we expected at 95% in both arms and did not change significantly after the intervention. Also, you might notice in terms of the ESBLs, over 90% of people were carrying these organisms at baseline. Of the ones that were speciated, they're all E. coli, so these are not the pathogenic Salmonella. So in conclusion, village-wide prophylaxis with single-dose oral ciprofloxacin quickly after the notification of a case in a village significantly reduced attack rates. And it could be a really attractive new epidemic response because you can do it fast, you can stock the medicines in the country, it's cheap, you don't have to deal with cold chains and injection supplies. We would have preferred to have more confirmed cases, but all of our trends in confirmed cases follow the suspected cases. Now, thinking about this as a strategy, you can't separate it from the potential impacts on antibiotic resistance, and we have to admit that there are very high prevalence of fecal carriage of both ciprofloxacin-resistant and ESBL bacteria. One thing that's for sure, it means that this population has a very high exposure to antibiotics. Hopefully it's not representative of all regions in the meningitis belt, but we will need to keep looking at this as we investigate the potential use of this strategy in other places. But I also want to remind you that the clinical significance of carriage of these resistant germs in gut flora is difficult to understand, and it may not be directly linked to later on pathogenic invasive disease. But we need to keep looking. So in terms of the next steps, I sort of preface this, but after the emergence of NMC in 2015, a WHO panel said, well, we don't have any evidence about this, someone should look. We provided some evidence, and then we reported back. And I think that the experts received these results quite favorably, but really said that we do need more evidence before any recommendations would be changed, both in terms of where this is done, whether it's in an urban epidemic or a rural epidemic. This was a very rural area where we were, or maybe earlier during the meningitis season. So this past season, we actually had ciprofloxacin pre-positioned in Niger and in Nigeria with research protocols approved. And then importantly, we also had contingency plans in place for sort of doing and documenting this strategy in a context either where a trial wasn't desired or wasn't possible. And then lastly, I think the important thing to take away from this is the ultimate answer to these meningococcal meningitis outbreaks is an effective, affordable, polyvalent meningococcal conjugate vaccine. Menafrivac was great for NMA, but now we see that we need against all of the other serogroups. In the meantime, until that is developed, this could be an attractive new response strategy. So this was a massive effort from a lot of people. I particularly want to thank our colleagues in the Ministry of Health of Niger, particularly Madarunfa district, also the CERMAS, also our friends in MSF, and the entire team of Epicentre Niger who put in a massive effort to implement this trial in very difficult conditions. Thanks.